So now we're going to talk about the different modes that the processor operates in. So the processor modes build upon one another. So we're going to start simple and get more complicated as we move through the families here. So we're going to start with the Cortex-M0. And really the boxes kind of overlap and show the various states. So if we start with the box in the back, we've got the Cortex-M processor. The darker blue thumb state is always present in these Cortex-M processors. So what's the alternative? Well, in some of the older architectures or higher end architectures moving up into the A profile, you could either be in an ARM, which is a 32-bit always instruction length, or the thumb state, which is what these parts are always in. They only execute thumb instructions. So it's the mostly 16-bit instructions and sometimes a 32-bit. So within that state, there are two different modes. There's a thread mode and a handler mode. And those would normally be associated with thread mode would be your mainline code. Handler mode would be any sort of interrupt or exception code. And you'll note in parentheses at the bottom, both of them are privileged. And we'll go over what privileged versus unprivileged means in a subsequent slide. But basically, this is how most embedded development is done. Each thread or each mode, whether you're in thread or handler, has access to the entire part. And when you come out of reset, you go into thread mode to start executing code. So that is how most all of Microchip's Cortex-M0 pluses look like. The SAMC21 actually has the processor modes that include privileged versus unprivileged states. So that makes this diagram a little more complicated. You can see that the original two blocks are there, the thread mode, and that's where reset lands you is in the privileged thread mode. This is the handler mode, which stays privileged as it was in the previous diagram. But what this adds is it adds a third box, which is an unprivileged thread mode. So privileged versus unprivileged, what does that mean? Well, privileged has access to any address in any state of the processor. Unprivileged takes away certain instructions, takes away certain accesses so that it is safer, and so that any code that is in unprivileged, if it crashes, the whole part doesn't crash because you still have the ability to execute in privileged mode. So the other thing that the arrow shows is that then they show where the transitions can and cannot occur. So both thread modes can have exceptions, which means you can take the path into handler mode, and the handler will return you to the mode that you were in before, either direction. But notice that between these two modes, there is a transition between unprivileged and privileged. And so this is a protected state to make sure that you can't come from here to here, land in here, and somehow be privileged. So the processor keeps track of that and ensures that you end up in the correct state. So the only way to go from unprivileged to privileged mode is through an exception. And that can be an external exception. That can be through specific instructions that actually implement a synchronous exception. And then in thread mode, you can go from privileged to unprivileged just directly. You can do that through an instruction. You do not need to go through the handler. So before we get to this, I guess the other thing that probably would be a good idea to mention is, in terms of privileged and unprivileged, why? What's the importance of that? The main application of that is in real-time operating systems. And so your tasks would typically be unprivileged and your RTOS would be privileged. So the Cortex-M23 then adds a whole other thing to the diagram here. As you can see, we add this concept of worlds. And so this is really what Trust Zone looks like. Trust Zone implements two worlds, both a secure world and a non-secure world. And inside each world is the whole model that we had before with privileged and unprivileged thread modes and a privileged handler mode. We will go into what all the transitions are between worlds in the Trust Zone section, but just know that the initial thought here is that not only do you have two worlds, but each world could even have its own real-time operating system running within the world and take advantage of additional privilege levels to make sure that things continue to run and they're handled safely. But like I said, we'll go into much more detail in the Trust Zone portion of this. Okay, so that got really complicated. So if we flip back to the Cortex-M4 and M7, it really goes back to what the SAMC21 had, which is the basic three-state mode. You're in thumb state, you've got thread and handler modes, both privileged and unprivileged. And so again, really good for implementing a real-time operating system, but no trust zone in these parts, so it stays relatively simple.